All right, so welcome everyone to Under McLennan and Fish's webinar on the new OSHA standards that were recently issued. We want to welcome everyone to what now feels like a monthly webinar to discuss significant update of the month for employers here in Massachusetts with respect to COVID. There's been a lot for everyone to handle for the past 18 months, not only in the employment law world, but beyond. And when we see some of the familiar names, if not faces, in attendance at these webinars, it makes us proud to be part of not only our LEB team, but also the extended collective client team that you all are a part of. So first I want to introduce the team. I will be presenting today with Natalie Capolazzo and David Rubin, and Liam O'Connell is also the head of our Labor and Employment and Benefits group here at Nutter. And each of us has been delving into these issues over the past couple months with numerous clients in a myriad of industries, but we also email each other daily on COVID-related questions to benefit from our group thinking on these emerging issues. And in many respects, this presentation is a product of those internal discussions over the past 6 days, and hopefully is to the benefit of all of our collective clients. These aren't easy answers on any of these COVID issues, but particularly with the new OSHA rule, conflicting government and court issues that make things even murkier, but we'll do our best to point out some of the key issues with the OSHA rule and what you should be thinking about right now. So here's what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to start with an overview of the ETS, which came out late last week. We want to discuss the scope because we've had many questions on that over the last few days. And last couple months, ever since President Biden issued the executive order, including 100 employee threshold, federal contractor issues. We'll then discuss the legal landscape, including, as I mentioned before, the conflicting state laws and a court order that just came out the other day, remarkably quick after the OSHA was issued, that threatens everything that we say here today and what OSHA has put forth. Then we'll get into the logistics of what you have to include in your policy, how the testing alternative might work, compliance obligations, all the nitty-gritty. And then we're going to open it up to a Q&A for a good portion at the end. We've received a number of questions over the past few days that we've tried to incorporate in the presentation, but to the extent you have any other questions or questions you don't think we have covered, please put those in the Q&A button, and we will try our best to answer some of those. And if we don't answer them within the course of the presentation, we can always try to reach out to you individually to answer that question as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Natalie, who is going to talk about the OSHA ETS in general.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Capolazzo. So this is the reason we're all here today, OSHA's emergency temporary standard. So back in September, you might recall that the White House directed OSHA to implement a rule requiring businesses to require that their employees are fully vaccinated against COVID or undergo testing on a weekly basis. So the emergency temporary standard was issued on the 4th, took effect on the 5th. And so right now, as you see, this covers businesses with 100 or more employees. The rationale behind that is that OSHA believes that these large employers already sort of have the infrastructure, the HR departments, the mechanisms in place to get this implemented quickly and efficiently. However, per the comments in the emergency temporary standard, OSHA is assessing whether and how to impose a mandate for smaller businesses, possibly by revising that 100 employee threshold. So for now, we're focusing on the mandate as it applies to 100 or more, but just with the understanding that there might be some overlap if OSHA issues a similar mandate to smaller businesses or restricts the scope to fewer employees to cover more businesses. So with that, the 100 employee threshold, it applies to employers that have multiple locations, even if those individual locations have less than 100 employees. So the rule of thumb is just if you have 100 or more employees in the aggregate, then you would be deemed a covered employer. Part-time and remote employees are included in this count. And franchisees, that's sort of a bit of an exception in that franchisees are just on a per franchisee basis counted. So it's not all of the franchisees together. It's whether each individual franchisee has 100 or more employees.
Natalie, one question I've had is that if there are multiple companies, but with the same ownership group, but the companies could be in completely different sectors, but they have the same owners, common ownership. Are they counted as a group to determine if they meet the 100 employee threshold, or is it each individual operating company on its own?
So yes, Chris, those employers, even if they have sort of different locations, different sectors, if it's all under the umbrella of the same company, the same organization, then all of those employees are counted. And the rationale for this is that OSHA, rather than focusing on whether each employee is subject to the mandate, the focus is on the employer. And so that's why the 100 employee tally is not specific to the employees, it's the broader sense. And similarly, that brings up the point where even if you have different entities that aren't sort of formally connected, if they all coordinate and have the same safety policies, or sort of health and safety and workplace safety are all managed as one, then those entities could be considered a single employer under this mandate.
Well, on the same issue, Natalie, I know we have a lot of clients who are either subsidiaries of foreign entities or have their own foreign operations. So do the overseas employees also count towards 100?
So no, that's a great question. The comments to the ETS state that in determining the number of employees, employers must include employees across all of their US locations. So based on this, we can assume that employees who are located outside of the United States are not counted.
Okay.
And just to run through a couple of the exceptions to the mandate, so federal contractors and subcontractors and healthcare workers, both of those groups are subject to their own vaccination requirements, so they're excluded from coverage of the ETS. Also, just to note that employees who work entirely remotely or entirely outside, they are excluded from the requirement that the mandate that they be fully vaccinated or undergo testing. However, they still would be counted in the 100 employee threshold. So back to that issue that even if the employees aren't subject to it, the employer is, no matter how many, it depends on how many employees that the employer has.
Okay.
So with that, I will turn it over to Chris to discuss some of the legal challenges that we're seeing.
So the OSHA issued the rule, it's ETS, on Thursday. On Friday, we sent out the invite to this presentation. We also sent out a client advisory, which I highly recommend everyone to read. And then as if they knew that we were planning on this presentation, on Saturday, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a temporary restraining order to block the OSHA's ETS. So they did this in response to, it's a case called BTS Holdings v. OSHA. And the plaintiffs are a combination of states in the Southeast and businesses located within the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals who filed a lawsuit to challenge the ETS and to block it. So with the current ruling, the current temporary restraining order, it means that as of right now, OSHA can't enforce this ETS anywhere. Now, they issued that ruling without hearing, the panel issued that ruling without hearing from the government, the federal government, and who had the ability to file a response brief yesterday. And now the plaintiffs have the ability to file a reply brief today, and therefore the Fifth Circuit's gonna issue a subsequent order, and in all likelihood, they will continue with their same decision and block the ETS. But there are also plenty of other lawsuits in other circuit courts of appeal, which are bringing up the same issue. And what's going to happen in the near future is that those other Court of Appeals are going to come up with their own orders. I'm guessing some of them are not going to come out the same way as the Fifth Circuit. And there will either be a bit of a Circuit Court of Appeals lottery to decide which court takes precedence in terms of who gets kind of the say on what will go nationwide, or the Supreme Court may weigh in the near future. So the Fifth Circuit's order is incredibly brief, given the profound impact that it has. It explains that its temporary blocking of the ETS is because the plaintiff's petition gave cause to believe that there are grave statutory and constitutional issues with the mandate, but it doesn't expound upon what those are. The central legal challenge, however, is that OSHA has exceeded its authority in issuing a mandate, and instead this type of mandate should have to be issued by Congress. A similar issue was in play when a Texas court in late 2016 halted President Obama's administration's changes to the overtime rules, which some of you may recall would have meant that a lot more people would have been eligible for overtime. But the issue never went further because there was also an election in November 2016, and I don't know if you recall, but President Trump was elected, and his administration elected to roll back those Obama administration changes. So we never really got to see how this played out, but we're going to see how it's going to play out this time. So now you have the situation where there are challenges in other circuits pending, and it's going to, you're kind of in a wait and see position where you don't know if this ETS is going to go into effect or not. Now, the issue then becomes that in order to comply with the ETS, you have to do certain things by December 5th, as we'll talk about a little bit later, including setting up your policy, which policy you're going to go with. And so because you have to do these by December 5th, you certainly need to be planning now as though the ETS is going to be in effect at that time. If you don't plan now, then you're going to be a little bit behind when you have to actually comply with it, assuming that the Fifth Circuit's decision is not the one that prevails. Now, you also have complicating matters further, is that you have to take into account certain state rules. If you operate in a state like Texas, there's an executive order from Governor Abbott that bans employers from forcing employees to get a vaccine. And that order goes even further than the ADA exceptions of religious or disability accommodations, but also says that essentially a personal objection to the vaccine is good enough, and an employer can't make you get the vaccine. Now, there are plenty of issues with that executive order, but if you're in Texas, it's just another, if you have employees in Texas, it's just another issue you kind of have to account for in determining how you want to do this. Now, the ETS that kicks in a few weeks says specifically that it trumps any state conflicting rules, any rules that might be contrary. So until December 5th, you may have to follow the state rules, but then once December 5th rolls around, you're going to have to follow the federal standard.
So Chris, does that mean that any given company that has operations in various places has to keep up with every single state rule?
Yes, it is essentially how this is playing out. Now, you could say, well, listen, the OSHA standard trumps everything, and therefore you could follow the federal standard and say that I have to follow this mandatory vaccine or vaccine testing protocol. But you could be subject to certain suits in some states. I mentioned Texas. There's also Florida, Louisiana, Oklahoma. They may issue similar orders. Arkansas has a law creating a vaccine mandate exemption when you can prove that you have COVID-19 antibodies. So in other words, if you've had COVID-19 before, not necessarily vaccinated. So you're really going to have, if you operate in in all these states, you're going to have to keep close tabs on what each state is doing. Not to mention the fact that you're going to have to keep close tabs on whether the OSHA's ETS actually goes into effect on December 5th. There are also, there's certain states, 22 states out there that have their own state OSHA programs. So they have their own OSHA program separate and apart from the federal program that covers private sector workers who are in those states. The FAQs to the OSHA's ETS make clear that these state OSHA programs have to be at least protective of the workers. In other words, they have to include the vaccine mandate or the vaccine testing alternative. And these state OSHA programs have 30 days to issue something that either adopts the same federal standards or something that is enhanced. Now, it's likely that some of these states, some of the states I've mentioned already, may challenge OSHA's rules outright. And so it's going to be for the courts to decide again how this is going to play out. But for most of the people in this webinar, Mass, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York, those are all on the federal confines of OSHA. So you're going to be following whatever ends up with the federal ETS. So that basically, in sum and substance, you got to prepare for the OSHA rule coming around in a few weeks, but we can't be certain that it's actually going to be the state of the law a few weeks from now. Move on to some of the logistics of the ETS, OSHA's ETS. And one of those is on the next slide is proof, how do you get proof of vaccination from an employee? If you have 75, and I've had clients dealing with this, if you have 75 employees, if you have 600 employees, do you need to track down every single employee to make sure that he or she has been vaccinated? And can you just kind of take their word that they got it? And the answer is no. You have to, under the ETS, you have to get an acceptable proof of vaccination in written form. And these can be, the record of immunization from the healthcare provider, pharmacy, the CDC vaccination card that people receive, medical records that expressly document that the individuals have the vaccine, or immunization records that would similarly say that they have the vaccine. Now, if an employee doesn't have any of these, if say they had their CDC card and then lost it somehow, the ETS say that the employee can sign an attestation that states their vaccination status and that they have lost their proof. But that attestation has to, kind of like an affidavit, if any of you are ever involved in litigation, it has to say that the employee is acknowledging that providing false information may subject them to criminal penalty. So hopefully everyone has their proof of vaccination. The hardest part is going to be tracking down anytime you're trying to get employees to provide you information. It's an administrative nightmare, but you have to do it. You have to get it, and you have to start collecting that soon. Once you have that information, you also have to create what the OSHA is calling a roster. So a list of every single employee and whether that employee has been vaccinated, not vaccinated, if they have an accommodation for vaccination because of religious or medical exemption. And so you're going to have to, HR or whoever is going to have to keep this roster and maintain it for as long as the ETS is in effect. Now, some clients have asked, well, our employees are concerned about who and who is not vaccinated when they come into the office, especially now that, manufacturing sites, offices, everything are more open than they may have been a year ago. And so some clients have asked, can we provide that roster to everyone in their company? Just so everyone knows, hey, this is who's vaccinated, this is who's not, this is why some people are wearing a mask, this is why not. And the answer is no. It is confidential, it is private information, medical information that you have to keep to only those who have a need to know it. So in other words, HR, the supervisor of the individual who is not vaccinated likely should, has a right to know to enforce either testing or masking situation. So, you can't broadly disseminate it by any means, and only provide it to those individuals within your organization who have a need to know whether someone is vaccinated or not. There's a new requirement in the OSHA rule that has that if someone is going to get vaccinated, you as the employer have to give 4 hours of PTO for each dose of that vaccination. If someone decides to get the vaccine on a Saturday or Sunday, you don't have to give them the time, but you do if it's during the working hours. And also to that end, you have to give a reasonable time off to recover from any side effects for the vaccine. They don't define what reasonable means. So there could be the potential that you get into a dispute between an employer and employee about how much time an employee needs to recover. But hopefully those disputes are few and far between. If someone needs a day or two, I'm assuming most employers are going to give that time to recover if there are side effects to the vaccine. Again, OSHA is doing everything it can to encourage vaccines, and so they want to make sure that employees don't feel that there are any negative employment consequences if they go and get the vaccine. Finally, each employer has to develop its own vaccine policy. Now, a lot of employers already have vaccine policies, and if it's a mandatory vaccine policy, then you're not going to have to do much in this respect other than perhaps create that roster that I mentioned, or perhaps get acceptable forms of proof. But you need to have a vaccine policy. There are also specific information you're going to have to provide to employees as part of this rule. So again, I would look at our client advisory, but there's a specific CDC document about the benefits of vaccine that you have to provide everyone. There's a specific language about no retaliation and criminal penalties for knowingly supplying false information that you're also going to have to provide. So those are the logistics of the vaccine mandate. I can turn it over to David now for further discussion of the actual, testing alternative program.
Thanks, Chris. So yes, and I just bear in mind, I'm seeing all the questions coming in on the Q&A, and we will get to them because there are some that they're right on point. So, but to talk a little bit about the testing alternative. So remember, you can have a policy that says everyone must be vaccinated unless they opt out of it, in which case they must go through a testing protocol and wear a mask. The regulation defines an acceptable test. I'm just going to pull it off right here as one that is cleared, approved, and authorized, including an emergency use authorization by the FDA. So if you have an FDA approved instant test or off-the-shelf test or whatever that is, that's okay. However, in order to use that test, the employee must be observed by the employer or by a telehealth proctor when he or she administers the test and gets the result. So there's been a lot of questions have been asked about just the mechanics of how that works. And quite honestly, I'm not sure. I don't know that anyone is quite sure exactly how that's going to work. I'm assuming that there are, insurance providers and HR providers out there that are at this very moment trying to put in place teams of healthcare proctors to help companies comply with this. The testing has to be done essentially every 7 days. The result of the test, a new test has to be done. The regulation says that the employer is not obligated to bear the cost of the test, meaning it would be borne by the employee, unless there is an alternative company policy or a collective bargaining agreement or some contrary law, which leaves it very vague. Massachusetts, as many of you know, has a law in place that goes back, probably goes back 50 years, I'm not even sure, that says that an employer must pay for any medical exam that the employer requires the employee to take if the employer selects the medical provider. So if the company says, we're sending you to our doctor for an exam, the company has to pay for that. Does that apply here? Not entirely clear, but I think that the conservative answer is probably it does, that the employer probably will have to bear the cost, or probably ought to bear the cost of that test, just to be cautious that he's not violating the Massachusetts law, unless until we get, more guidance from the Attorney General or the courts here in Massachusetts. The other requirement for someone who opts not to be vaccinated is that that person has to wear a mask, and the mask, a suitable mask, is defined in the statute. I won't get into the details of it, but has to wear a mask whenever he or she is in the workplace around other people. There are certain times they don't have to wear a mask. That is, if they're in an enclosed room alone, or if they're out in the open. Those are the two, or if they're eating or drinking. I mean, those are essentially the three exceptions, most common exceptions to when they would have to wear a mask in the workplace.
Hey, David, can I ask you a question about testing that I think is going to be extremely difficult for folks? Not the question, but how to account for it.
Am I going to know the answer to this question?
We'll find out.
Okay.
How does an employer practically oversee the testing? In other words, can you purchase a bunch of OTC rapid tests, send them out to all your employees and say, hey, take these tests at home before you come in, and then just, tell us if everything's good, and they got to take those tests every 7 days. It sounds as if there's some oversight that has to happen.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm getting at with the telehealth proctor or the employer observing them taking it. And that's, I think the first part of your question is, can it simply be, one of these over-the-counter tests that you could give to them? Yeah, I think if they're FDA approved, I think that test would be fine. But, and again, I'm looking here at the regulation. It says that it can't be both self-administered and self-read unless observed by the employer or an authorized telehealth proctor, which I think means that the employer has to be, you have to have your company nurse or your supervisor or someone standing there and watching the person give themselves the test and take the reading. I know that the statutes, the regulations are a little confusing. Does it have to be one or the other? I read it to mean you have to observe both. You have to observe them taking the test and doing the reading.
So there has to be some interaction with the employer or the employer's agent, telehealth provider. You can't just have someone take a test and then bring the slip with the results.
No, it has to be essentially authenticated by someone observing them that it was that person that took the test and that was the reading of that person taking the test, on both ends, which I can't imagine a lot of employers are going to want to be in that business of overseeing that.
So that's where one employer choice is to just have a straight vaccine mandate.
Well, that's right. So going back to what you had said before, that you can have, the employer can have one of two approaches. You can simply say everyone has to be vaccinated unless they're entitled to a reasonable accommodation, and we'll talk about that later. Or they can have a policy that says, if you don't want to be vaccinated, you have to go through this testing protocol every 7 days. It seems to me they're making the testing protocol sufficiently unattractive to make you want to opt into the vaccine mandate.
And it's the employer's choice to do one of those two.
The employer's choice, correct. Right, because Chris, if you have a policy that says everyone has to be vaccinated, we're not going to give you the choice, then the employee who says, well, I am politically opposed to it, I don't think you have that right. That's not an option to that person, not unless they're legally entitled to a reasonable accommodation due to a religious or disability. And we'll get back to that. So to the next slide. So the compliance deadlines. Well, let's take these in the reverse order. So by December 5 is the deadline to comply with everything other than the vaccination weekly testing issues. So requiring face masks for anyone that's unvaccinated, which, you know, if you're not already complying with the vaccine policy, then everyone's going to be wearing face masks. And the reporting obligations go into effect. It's January 4 when the deadline of next year, so we're just about 2 months out, will be the deadline for employees to be fully vaccinated or to begin with weekly testing, if that's the option that's offered. And I think in building in these deadlines, part of it was maybe to allow companies to get ramped up, but I think part of it, I think also was foreseeing the litigation that you were talking about, Chris, and letting that play out, giving that a little bit of time to play out. So we'll have a better sense by December 5th and certainly by January 4 of where things stand. The regulations also talk about the reporting requirements and talk about employers must report each work-related COVID-19 fatality within 8 hours and each work-related COVID-19 inpatient hospitalization within 24 hours. That's pretty consistent with the rule that OSHA has had, or their guidance going back to, I think it was sometime last year. And for anyone who is familiar with that guidance, it means that if you have someone, an employee who has been, has been hospitalized with COVID, you have to do some measure of review or investigation to determine if it's reasonably likely that they contracted it at the workplace. I'm not going to get too much into that now, but I will say it is a little bit of a slippery slope to go too deeply into that issue, into those issues, and in part because you start stepping out over the lines into the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I think that is sort of a good segue into our question and answer period, because I think this is the one we really wanted to start on this issue, because it's probably the most common, and that is the effect of the ADA on all of this. So we can take that slide down that we're on here. And say, so looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, that's a law that's been in effect since whatever, 1990, I think. And it says that an individual who is disabled, has a medical disability, and requires a reasonable accommodation to perform the essential functions of his or her job, may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation if it's possible. And that, and it's parallel with the provision in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that says, a person whose religious beliefs may require a reasonable accommodation to allow that person to perform the essential functions of his or her job, may be entitled to such an accommodation. And so that opens us up to the question of, well, we'll start with the disability. What about the person who has a disability, has some underlying medical condition that makes it impossible for that person to get a vaccine? And I open it to Chris or Natalie, whoever wants to jump in on that one, because we hear this question all the time.
We have heard it all the time, and even before the OSHA standard, when employers on their own were issuing vaccine mandates for their workforce. And you know, if an employee has a medical condition, perhaps an allergy to the vaccine or immunocompromised in some way that makes the vaccine not good for them according to their primary care physician, perhaps, then you as the employer will have to provide the accommodation of permitting them not to get the vaccine, as long as it doesn't create an undue hardship on you as the employer. And that's where kind of that analysis is going to be. But it also has to depend on what the accommodations, if it is a position where the employee can do it 100% fully effectively from a remote environment at home, that's one thing. If they're working on a manufacturing line, or if they're a sales employee who is with customers all the time, that's another thing. where that remote option is not an option, and the undue hardship, analysis really comes into play. But if an employee does request a reasonable accommodation due to a disability or medical condition, then you do have to engage in the interactive process as you would with any ADA situation.
Yeah,
and it's individualized.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Each person has to be treated on his or her own circumstance. And I'll say, we've had this with one client had this issue arise several months ago, where employee came forward, the employer had put in their own mandatory vaccine policy. An employee came forward and said they have a medical condition that not only precludes them from getting a vaccine, but precludes them from wearing a mask. And the employer had to determine that those two things combined made it so that the person was not qualified to perform their essential functions of their job in the workplace, and resulted in termination. That's a hard case, but that's the analysis you have to go through sometimes. So then the question of religious accommodation, that is, if a person says my religious beliefs somehow prevent me or preclude me from being vaccinated, are they entitled to a reasonable accommodation? And we know that the standard for reasonable accommodation in religious cases is lower than that of in a disability for disabled employees. That there are the courts to say, and the way the statutes are written, to say that a disabled employee is entitled to a greater deference in determining whether a reasonable accommodation is required than a person who raises a religious objection. But if it's a validly held religious belief and it can be reasonably accommodated in the workplace, there may be an obligation to do so. And we've come across that in a couple of cases. I'm sure a number of employers have as well.
But those different standards is a critical element in terms of the undue hardship analysis between the religious exemption and the medical disability exemption. So,
right.
Employers definitely want to. That's why you can treat those two requests kind of in separate ways if you get them from different employees.
Right. I'm just looking through some of these questions here, and
there are a lot.
There are a lot, but one jumped out at me while you were talking earlier, Chris, and that was, so in allowing the time off, the paid time off for vaccine, et cetera, can that be charged against accrued PTO, accrued vacation?
In terms of the time off to get the actual vaccine, no,
Yeah.
it's separate and apart, and you're supposed to pay at the employee's regular rate. For those 4 hours.
So you can't deduct it from their accrued time.
Right, but you can for the if they need time off to recover for side effects.
Okay.
That can be. And that, in that same vein, we had a few questions that asked, boosters are all in the news now. How do we account for boosters in terms of the OSHA ETS? And the FAQs say that boosters don't count quite yet. So, first, that means both that your employees are not required to get boosters yet under this ETS, and also you as an employer are not required to get the time off to get a booster. I think we all kind of assume that will change at some point, but it has not yet, and maybe we'll see how all those legal challenges play out before OSHA takes that next step to account for boosters.
Natalie, I'm not sure if you referenced this or not when you were talking in your presentation, but I see a couple of questions relating to this. Employees who can or do work remotely, how does this all going to apply to them?
So thanks, David. If the employees work exclusively remotely, they're never reporting to the workplace, they are excluded from the vaccine and or, if offered by employer, testing alternative mandate. However, those employees are still counted for purposes of determining whether the employer has 100 or more employees. So those are the two, I think, key things to keep in mind for employees that work remotely. They themselves don't have to comply with the vaccine mandate. However, they're still considered employees for purposes of the 100 count. And same thing, there was a question in here about employees out of state. Same thing, even though they're in a different state, they count towards the 100, but they themselves, as long as they're truly not reporting to a workplace, they are not required to have the be part of the vaccine mandate or weekly testing.
So, okay, so just pull that up, just so we make clear. So there's really two different things. One is who we count as part of the 100, right?
Correct.
And the remote employees count in that. I think part-time count in that as well?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so they all count, but in terms of who has to be tested, vaccinated, et cetera, if they're working remote, solely working remote, then that's a different standard and they don't have to be.
Correct. And same with employees who work entirely outside. If they're not reporting to a workplace, same thing, counted for 100 for the 100 threshold, but not subject to the rules.
And then if you have an employee who works remotely 99% of the time, but they have to come in for quarterly team meetings, I'm assuming that they then would just have to get tested for leading up to that team meeting.
Correct. They would have to get tested at least 7 days prior to coming to the workplace. So similar requirement, but not
within 7 days of coming to the workplace.
Within 7 days, correct.
Yeah. Within 7 days in advance of coming to the workplace. I don't want to make this more complicated, right? And I'm looking at this list here. There's a lot of these questions on these same issues. Someone asks, where an employee requests a reasonable accommodation and goes remote, does that mean the employer would need to bar the employee from attending work-related events? And I think the answer is yes. Unless the employee gets tested, wears a mask, and the employer permits that kind of attendance in that context. Chris and Natalie, do you see any of the others that you want to pull out of here? Because I know I've grabbed a bunch.
If you have employees who have been previously vaccinated, you don't have to now grant them the PTO time that everyone else is going to get vaccinated. It's just prospective. We had one question about that. So if someone was vaccinated 6 months ago, they don't get another 4 hours off.
Got it.
Unfair, perhaps, but it is.
Yeah, right. And I see another one here, and I've had this question come up already as well, and that is about sharing information about who's vaccinated and who isn't. And a lot of this is sort of, I get, seems inconsistent or contradictory, but the rule is that yes, the employer has to compile this information, maintain the roster that Chris talked about. You have to maintain a record of individuals' vaccination status and accommodations if needed. You have to maintain it, but you have to maintain it as confidential medical information, which means under the ADA and under OSHA, you can't share that outside of with the with some very limited individuals who have a need to know. So yes, you do have to maintain this. You have to compile and maintain this confidential information. You can't share individual information with other people who don't have an entitlement to know, even though someone who may be receiving an accommodation or maybe you may have allowed to, if you have a testing policy, someone who is, you will know who's not vaccinated by the fact that they're wearing a mask every day, or you can infer that that person isn't, so be it. But you can't share that information specifically. There is also a provision in the law and the regulation that employees can request data on your vaccination rates, but it has to be provided in an aggregated form, right? You have to be able to say, we have 312 employees in this workplace, of whom 502 are vaccinated, and but it has to be in an aggregated form.
Right. The key is you just can't identify who is or who is not.
Right. And again, it goes right back to that ADA issue.
And we're getting a lot of questions about accommodations for religious exemptions, and questions or variations of what type of documentation should I as an employer require, and what do I do as an employer if it appears as though employees are using 10 employees are submitting the same template that apparently has come off the internet, claiming a sincerely held religious belief that would require them an accommodation from exemption. And it's, I think there's going to be a lot it's going to be said about this, as time passes by. But it is each individual's sincerely held religious belief. If you as the employer have reason to believe it's not sincerely held religious belief, you can kind of pressure test it, but there's no specific documentation that would be required. Some employers are using forms that have employees kind of write out exactly what the reasoning is. But I think it's, employers are more than likely going to have to move to the undue hardship analysis rather than the threshold question of what is a sincerely held religious belief. Like I said, unless there is a true reason why you should question it.
Well, and to be clear, I mean, I know several of us have had the same experience where, and I'm sure some of the clients out there have had this experience where an employee will come with a letter that does appear to, you can find it on the internet, or various forms of it on the internet, that said that the employee is Roman Catholic and holds sincerely held religious beliefs, and that state that the use of, I believe it's the use of stem cell in the research and development of different vaccines, or the underlying processes in different vaccines make it so that they have a religious objection to being vaccinated with these particular vaccines. Several clients have had the same letter that I've encountered, and I think Chris, I know you and Liam both clients have seen the same letter, and you have to deal with it and address it. I'm not, on a case-by-case basis. And again, probably the issue isn't really whether this person has a sincerely held religious belief. I think probably the right approach is, well, is it possible or appropriate to be able to reasonably accommodate that in our workplace? And in some cases you can't.
One question I'm seeing pop up a few times in here is about outside salespeople. They're not reporting to the employer's location, but they're visiting customers externally, and whether the vaccine mandate, or if offered by employers, the testing option apply to those employees. So the regulations, the comments to the ETS state that the rules do not apply to employees who do not report to a workplace where other individuals, such as coworkers or customers, are present. And the fact that customers is included suggests to me that if the employees are out visiting sites where there are customers, they are also subject to the rules. So either the vaccine mandate or the weekly testing requirement. So my suggestion would be to treat outside salespeople as subject to the rules.
Right, especially because the FAQs also talk about if an employee works completely outside, they can be exempt from the rules. And so I'm thinking those would be off-site outsides, and so anything that is off-site inside should qualify. So I agree completely.
Just bear with me. Someone asked, and I think this goes back to the underlying fundamental core of this whole thing, and that is, what are your thoughts regarding businesses mandating vaccination so as not to have to comply with and track COVID testing? Well, again, I think that's the point of part of the way the regulation is written. I think they're making the obvious choice to do exactly that. right? It will be easier for employers to mandate vaccine rather than to grant the testing and masking alternative. But I will raise this, and then I've heard this from a lot of clients, that the difficulty in hiring and retaining employees these days, is really discourages and will discourage employers from wanting to do anything that might turn away any employees. So I think that's going to be something that we're really going to have to balance.
And on the flip side, you have employees who, if you adopt the testing alternative, some employees may not feel comfortable coming back into the office knowing that fellow coworkers are not vaccinated. And so, there's a balance where in order to attract employees in that respect, you may have to go to the fully mandatory vaccinated policy.
I think this question is sort of related to that point. To clarify, is it correct that employees who have not proven themselves to be vaccinated will have to wear a mask even if they are tested and test negative? Yes, I think the face covering requirement applies to unvaccinated employees, even if they're testing and providing negative test results, except in limited situations where they're eating, drinking, the usual very limited situations where you'd be permitted to not have a mask on, but generally, yes.
And I see someone asked a question about the OSHA reporting. It said, when did the reporting of employees being hospitalized begin? So that's a somewhat convoluted issue, but so if you look at, forget COVID, long before COVID, the OSHA rule was if an employee suffers a workplace injury that requires in-person or inpatient care, it has to be reported within, I think, 24 hours, within a certain period of time. And if an individual suffers, it dies as a result of a workplace illness or injury, that has to be reported within X number of hours. So that's a long-standing OSHA rule. And so they've been trying to adapt it to COVID. That is, if someone contracts COVID and it has to be hospitalized and they contracted it at work, well, then it would be deemed a workplace illness. But how do you determine that it was? And that's really become, that's a really hard question. And we could spend all day talking about that one. I'm happy to discuss it with someone further if they want, but that's where that issue really arises. That's it's sort of one of the basic OSHA rules adapted to COVID. Probably have time for a couple more.
We have one question where if the requirement is that if you go to the mandatory vaccine policy, can an employee say, I'm just going to work remotely then to avoid either the vaccination or the testing? Do you as an employer have to allow that employee to work remotely? Now, assuming there's no medical or religious accommodation issue, but simply employee preference, then you do not have to simply permit the employee that wants to work from home, either because they don't feel safe in the office or because they want to avoid getting tested or the vaccine.
And I think on a related question, someone says, oh, now it scrolled away, but if someone has an accommodation, religious or medical accommodation, does that mean they're also exempt from the testing and the masking? And absolutely not. It means just the opposite. That would be the accommodation. Is an accommodation to not getting the vaccine, you will be required to be tested and masked. Unless,
of course, the accommodation requires something with respect to masking or potentially testing.
Well,
right, your scenario earlier.
Right. Well, and Chris, we've talked about the scenario where you have employees who, let's say you are not a healthcare employer, you're not in the healthcare industry directly, you're not regulated in that way, but your employees are often, part of their job is to go into healthcare facilities. And I know we have clients who do that, right? In that instance, they're going to have to be able to meet those standards. Is that right?
An essential function of the job, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Which is, again, comes back to why we have to look at each request for an accommodation on its individual basis. You know, less on the I guess more on what is the employee's job, what is their required, what are they required to do? Is it possible to have them do their job working remotely? Is it possible to have them do their job wearing a mask and being tested, etc.? Let's just do, I think, one more here. Someone asked, oh, let me just see. I keep they keep scrolling past me here. Regarding the cost of testing, in New Hampshire, ERs are not allowed to pass the cost of a required medical test procedure on to the employee. I didn't know that. How does this impact the federal directive that the employer doesn't have to pay for it? Actually, I love this question. I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's a great question. It's one that we were talking about earlier, and that is the way these regulations state it. It does state that there can be contrary laws that will override this for purposes of who pays for the testing. And so by the same token, there is part of the regulation that says the regulation preempts any laws that aren't as stringent as this. That's one of the kinds of areas I think where we're going to have to see how that resolves out. I would say that, and I think I said it before with regard to the mask statute, I think the safest, most conservative route would be to comply with the state law with regard to the payment of testing and to pay for the employer to pay for the testing itself, which I suppose would be one more reason not to grant testing as an option to everyone. Unless there's anything else you guys want to add, I think.
No, I mean, we had one kind of concluding question was, you know, how do we think this is all going to play out? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, Natalie, or Dave, in terms of?
I'll leave that one to you.
I mean, to me, it's entirely uncertain. If I had to place a bet, I would say that the OSHA standard will at some point go through. Whether it gets delayed for a while, that might be. But it's, to me, it is within the confines of the safety and welfare of an employment setting. But we shall see.
Right. And
but the bottom line is you got to prepare like it is going to come.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think it's incumbent on everyone to assume it's going to go into place and to be ready for it.
Get ready to roll everything out, but not necessarily issue your policy yet.
Right.
Unless you want to on your own. You know, none of this is prohibiting you from doing your own vaccine policy, obviously.
Right.
It's just whether you're mandated to or not.
I see a lot of questions we haven't gotten to, and you know, we'll try to get back to some of you on them. Some of them that are more answerable than others. But I want to thank everyone for attending. Really appreciate the opportunity to have done this with you, and look forward to seeing you the next time.